part of the reason I'm interested in political economy is to think about how do you create a world where 7 billion or 8 billion human beings, or however many are left after the process of industrial capitalism has its way with us. How do we create a world where we are not keeping body and soul together, that the basics of life are met, so that we could create an environment where we're having a spiritual creative renaissance on this planet, where all human beings can contribute to this bigger project. And that's also then related to the idea of mythology, right? And what is the shared mythology? What is the spirit project of our generation, or the generations that are now working together to create the post-anthropocentric world?
Greetings, friends. You're listening to the As Temperatures Rise podcast, a space of inquiry and listening, where we dialogue about what it means to be human in these complex and troubled times. I'm your host, Katie Teague, and I was inspired to start this podcast to share voices and perspectives that I've turned to in my own effort to make meaning of this bewildering and disruptive moment, like sense-making breadcrumbs in the tangled forest of the Anthropocene. I don't always agree with all perspectives, and I'm sometimes disturbed. Such is the nature of being transformed in and by a transformative time. There's a growing common understanding that the crises we face today are symptomatic of the end of an era of runaway exploitation and infinite growth madness, the self-terminating logic of human exceptionalism that's encoded in our dominant modern paradigm, and that we stand at the threshold of making a species-wide choice to restore kinship to the living world, to be of the earth again, and bring forward a relational and life-affirming, bio-reverent world space that's ecologically, culturally, and spiritually regenerative. This shift requires deep listening and allowing our worldview to grow up and transform our understanding of ourselves as humans and our humble place within the complex web of creation. To move forward and through, we must look backward and reckon and let the disturbances of now change us. As temperatures rise on the planet and between us, may these conversations serve your own meaning-making, turmoil, and transformation in the smallest of ways. May your temperature rise to the perfect boiling point of the phase shift that's needed for our collective evolution. And today's guest was the voice we heard at the beginning of this episode, that of Alnoor Ladha. Alnoor is a political strategist, writer, and activist working at the intersection of political organizing, structural change, and narrative work. He was the co-founder and executive director of The Rules, which was a global network of activists and organizers focused on changing the rules that create inequality, poverty, and ecological destruction. He's a co-founder of Tierra Valiente, a post-capitalist community in the jungle of northern Costa Rica. He's also currently a board member of Culture Hack Labs and the Emergence network. Alnoor, in my experience, and why I wanted to have him on the podcast, is a humble steward of these transition times. He offers really useful lenses in which to understand where we are. He has a knack for deep synthesizing of various streams from his own study and practice. And we get a good taste of that in this episode. So let's dive in. Well, gratitude to you for being here on the podcast, for taking the time to be here with me.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, like I said before we officially started, I feel like we've been on a crash course to meeting for some time. I've been tracking you and your work really since you co-founded the rules.org, which was on the heels of Occupy Wall Street, if I'm remembering correctly. Right. And at that time, I was working on my documentary film, Money and Life, which was a bit of a parallel path, a self-directed PhD on trying to connect the dots and understand the money system and its relationship to the climate crisis and the mental health crisis and crisis of community and this growing environment of mistrust. And so the rules.org, which closed its doors last year, 2019, right, was an artist collective looking at the root causes of many of these systemic crises of inequality, poverty, the ecological.
It was mainly an activist collective, but they came in various stripes. So yeah, there was a couple of artists, there was farmers, there was policy people, there were community organizers, and there was both a think tank arm that's aim was try to get more progressive and radical ideas into the mainstream and make them feel like common sense. Things like universal basic income and regenerative agriculture and commons based stewardship of land and resources and indigenous knowledge and other ways of knowing and being. And then there was an organizing arm that worked directly with social movements, peasant movements, farmer movements, indigenous movements, and mostly in the global south. Brazil, South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, India, etc.
Wonderful. And you all still have your website up with case studies and such, which I think some people on the podcast might want to go down that rabbit hole.
And there's a mini documentary just interviewing some leading voices in the activist space called Action in the Anthropocene.
Wonderful.
It's on the homepage. Yeah.
Well, all of this is to say that you've done a lot of deep work, both activist work in the world and deep inner work around, understanding the structural causes of the transition that we're in. And so I like to start the podcast from that higher level context of like, how do you articulate, as I feel like the curtain is being pulled back on the matrix with COVID and the social uprisings, and the Overton window is opening on being able to talk about some of these other formerly taboo things. So how do you articulate now, here year 2020, the poly crises that we're facing, and what has, as you were saying, what's now commonly been dubbed the Anthropocene?
I think there's maybe three lenses, and maybe we'll try to put three arrows in the air and do them simultaneously. The first is, I think, in some ways the most important, is that we have to understand the historical context that got us here. And, it depends how far back we want to go. But there's an argument to say that this current crisis, this moment of the Anthropocene, in some ways really started with the Neolithic Revolution and the invention of agriculture and farming and sedentary lifestyles. And from there we had basically the initiation of the Ponzi scheme of civilization. And so more surplus meant that we now created structures to house that surplus. And then we had militias and police and military and armies and all of these things protecting that. And then a hierarchy of priests and emperors and sun gods managing the oversight of the machinery and the bureaucracy of extraction. And that in some ways was our fall from Eden and our fall from grace. And, there's some arguments to say it goes back even further, that when Homo sapiens genocided hominids and other beings on the plains of the African savanna and the Fertile Crescent, that this was that sort of the human line as we know it was sort of based on this initial genocide. Now, for our purposes, maybe what makes the most sense is to go to the Enlightenment as the moment. And a period really between the so-called Renaissance and so-called Enlightenment, and that period where colonization started, where Western Europeans went into the rest of the world and saw it as a field of bounty for their taking. And at the same time, the scientific method was created, a type of logic that came from Newtonian mechanics and metaphors of the world as a sort of mechanized system. The Descartes split of mind and body, and the Industrial Revolution. And there's so many other players, like Francis Bacon's famous line of "nature must be tortured for her secrets," is a good sort of embodiment of that. But so is the idea of man is the measure of all things, right? One of the famous tropes of the Enlightenment, which says so much about the dominant worldview. And the reason I think it's important to situate ourselves in that historical context is that we've all been programmed with those belief systems from then on, right? And if man is the measure of all things, then otherness is the ontology of all other things and beings, right? Anything that is not, especially a white Western European male, was seen as other, seen as commodity, seen as disposable. And then the sort of third aspect of that trinity then is that capital is the measure of man, right? And modern banking started in Renaissance Italy with the Medicis, and then this sort of the combination of forces that came through the Industrial Revolution, mass extraction, colonialism, the population boom that resulted in this sort of mechanization of processes, and also the blood and destruction of the global South. And of course, then Christianity's role in the Protestant work ethic that sort of in some ways perfected capitalism, right? And then we get to, let's say, we jump, right? And we see the sort of snowball effect of these belief systems, in some ways perfected in neoliberalism, which was born in the late 70s and early 80s, originally by philosophers and economists like Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek, but then taken to their logical extreme with people like Margaret Thatcher and Reagan, and then the whole sort of corpocracy that has sort of resulted in this moment, right? And so there's this very strong historical impulse of disconnection from nature, othering, seeing the individual as the unit of all reality, which has created atomization and like this hyper individualization, and then also like the hyper consumption from the post World War era, World War II era, and the sort of belief in this in the need for hegemony, in the need for power, which is kind of now where we see like the Davos World Economic Forum kind of global elite worldview, that there has to be a superpower, and the sort of jockeying for sort of imperialist imposition of that power over the rest of the world. And so all of these forces sort of have led to this moment. And neoliberalism, which is a word that people sometimes feel, well, let's not use that word. Let's just say capitalism. And it's really important, I think, to presence it, right? George Monbiot, I think last year in an article said, imagine sitting in a ration line in Soviet Russia in the 1970s, waiting for your daily bread, and not knowing the name of the economic system that put you there. That's the level of illiteracy we have economically and politically. So we're in this system of neoliberalism, which is the logical outcome of 10,000 years of separation from nature, 5,000 years of patriarchy and hierarchy at least, and 500 years of colonialism, genocide, imperialism, domination, and 200 years of industrialization, Enlightenment logic, hyperconsumption, hyper-individualism. And so we get to this moment and we're like, well, how did we get here? And so one lens is definitely that historical lens. I think a second lens is to understand the spiritual implications of what's happening, the metaphysical implications of what's happening in this transition, which there's no simple way to do, but to say that our belief that, even let's say the Marxist belief, right, in a historical materialism, that's just one lens to look at this, but there's a deeper sort of impulse towards novelty and complexity that's happening in the universe, that is playing out in the realm of belief systems and ideology, especially spiritual ideology, that is also historically connected, right? Aristotle, for example, sort of brought in the notion of the prime mover, right, which is this belief in a teleology of God, of some force that created time before time, and that, of course, led to Christianity, Islam, Judaism, right? All of these spiritual impulses are also in the same line, and they have moral implications, right? Our belief that the natural world is our entitlement to destroy, consume, own, etc. There's spiritual implications and karmic implications to these beliefs. And so that's another lens by which we could look at this current moment as sort of, in some ways, the age of consequence, that we are now playing out the set of outcomes that from decisions and beliefs about the divine and what is sacred and what is not sacred in the world. And then another lens, and maybe the third lens that I'll just presence, is thinking of the market system, whatever you want to call it, neoliberalism, market fundamentalism, late stage capitalism, as a complex, adaptive, evolutionary system. So it's alive. Even as we're describing it now and talking about it, it is a responsive, living being in and of itself. And so it has the ability to change, but it's also functioning on generative rules that are man-made. And so understanding it as alive is really important to, I think, understanding where we go from here. And so, we're told that the merit system works, for example, right? That if you work hard and you go to the right schools, and you'll be elevated within this system. But actually, the opposite is true. The people who best serve the logic of capitalism are pulled to the top. So it's not a merit system. It's a system that rewards those who keep it intact. And so, well, what are the values of the system? We just have to look around us, right? It's extractive, it's short-termist, it rewards greed, it rewards consumption, it rewards status, hyper-individualization, etc. And so the people who best serve the logic of that system are the ones who become presidents and CEOs and all of these things. And when you see the world in that way, there's a shift that happens, right? Instead of looking at the cover of Fortune magazine or Wall Street Journal or what's on Netflix as people who have somehow made it or are successful, we can see them as just the people who are in some ways the most sociopathic, the people who are willing to do whatever it takes to be agents of this life-destroying system. And for me, that's a more interesting lens to see the current moment, and also see what our task is to deconstruct the system and create something new.
Great. And before we double click on yes, this work of narrative in service of cultural evolution and what you're up to now, this last lens that you just spoke, I heard you in another podcast, I don't know, a year or two ago, I can't remember the podcast, but it was a real, you helped articulate and connect, make some connections for me that was a real aha. And I know for me, it's just in like understanding context creates more capacity, internal capacity, more room for choice. And I want to actually ask you a personal question before we go more deeply into where do we go from here. Is like, personally, how did you get to being so involved in this work? I experience you as I think evidenced by what you just shared with us and why I wanted to get you on, again, very, very articulate and a strong, rigorous critic of the dominant culture. And very loving and caring, coming from a deeply loving, caring space. It's not tearing down just to tear down. But I'm curious, was there a catalyst kind of for your departure from conventional culture?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for asking. Yeah, I'm always hesitant when we go into the personal, because I feel like then sort of people like attribute like whatever historical circumstance to the reason you got there, and at the same time, of course, like the subjective lens of being in a certain body at a certain time completely affects your perception. And so as much as it serves the story, I grew up in a Sufi household, so I grew up in a Sufi tradition. Both my parents come from the same tribe of an Islamic tribe of Muslims that left Arabia and went to Egypt, and then migrated to Persia, and then went through India to East Africa. So there was a lot of migration in our historical line, and in some ways that really created a sense of cosmopolitanism and internationalism. I never felt of place in a way others may feel. And so in that sense, I never had ownership of land or an idea that something belonged to me. And that was helpful in the deschooling and the deprogramming for sure. And then my dad was exiled from Uganda in 1972 by Idi Amin as part of the African independence movements, and ended up in a refugee camp outside of Austria, and got shipped to Vancouver one day as part of a UN program. And so I also felt that sense of like luck, right? The genetic lottery that comes from my dad being shipped to Vancouver, where, it could have been anywhere else. And being socialized in a country like Canada, where there is a deep sense of multiculturalism and pluralism, and at the same time, there's also a deep sense of racism and colonialist settler guilt that has not been reconciled. And so being sensitive as a child, you really feel that, and you really feel the omission of the indigenous history of that land. And coming from desert mystics that were indigenous to Arabia, and always having that oral tradition as part of the Sufi lineage, I was more interested in the first peoples of that land than I was in the settlers. And that being part of those cultures and being initiated into certain practices and ways, and having exposure to Cree elders and Haida elders and Salish elders was very profound experience for me. I'd also say, like, being a child of immigrants who were quite critical of the dominant culture they were in. So that was always a helpful context, because I wasn't just socialized into a world where it was like, this is the norm. It was kind of like, my parents would just be in these reflections of like, I don't understand why these Canadians wear skates and have these sticks and spend all these hours playing hockey, beating each other up. Like, you definitely don't need to do that if you don't want to do that. And so I had this ability to be able to like dissolve the boundaries of the culture. So I wasn't so enmeshed in it, right? And that was very helpful for sure. A second thing is, like, growing up in a Sufi tradition, in a mystical tradition, there was always this broader sense, like one of our first teachings on Sufism was Allah is a metaphor for the universe. So God is a metaphor for the universe becoming self-aware. And so that sort of worldview really informed my idea of the unfolding nature of reality happening through us. And then that really begs the question of like, well, why are some people in certain bodies and other people in other bodies? And if you incarnate into a white body, there's all these advantages and privileges, and this almost this belief that race doesn't exist for white people. And yet our experience is very racialized. And so in some ways the spiritual led me to the political work. And then the climate of Vancouver, a home for environmental activism, a big and very strong indigenous resistance movement, and then Seattle 99 happened, and I was a sort of naive student of climate change, and I remember someone in one of the Seattle teach-ins said something along the lines of, climate change is not man-made, it's capital-made. And so when that registered, and I was like, oh, interesting. I don't really understand how the global political economy works. And if this is the driver of climate change, and this is the driver of inequality and poverty, then I need to become a student of that. Like, I need to understand how that works in order to be more useful to the climate justice movement or the global justice movement or what have you. So it was definitely a confluence of factors. And then, I think there's just also something that is not unique to my story, is whenever you feel uncomfortable with the dominant culture, one of the things that happens is that the culture's reinforcement mechanism is to say try nationalism, patriotism, even the idea that you should be grateful to be here, right? And the only reason you exist is because this country let you in. All of those tropes didn't feel true to me. And so I think whenever you feel like an outsider or unwelcome, or marginalized or oppressed in some way, there's a resilience that gets cultivated. There's an internal inquiry that gets cultivated, which is, what is the nature of this prison that I'm in? Socially constructed cultural prison. And I think that's an inquiry, that never ends. We're still in it, right?
Indeed, endless. Thanks for sharing the personal journey. I err with you on being a bit allergic to sharing a lot of the personal by way of the propensity to reify identity. And yet I've also received feedback from podcast listeners, right? Because I often come into these things deeply already moored in who I'm interviewing and a few steps ahead.
Of course. And I think it's also important to give context. And I think part of our deprogramming is understanding that, the Occidental mind and in Western culture, we want context to be set up for us in a certain way, right? And part of our othering is like, I want to know why this person is saying this thing that is either makes me uncomfortable or is inconsistent with what I'm saying. And so in order for me to believe what they're saying or entertain what they're saying, I either have to like them or understand their journey, right? And of course, we're in that culture, and so we do that, and we have to accommodate for that. And at the same time, the reason I presence my uncomfortableness is there's another thing happening, which is, I may be saying things to you that you already know, and I am just a fractal reflection of you, as opposed to some other, right? Giving you this information. It's like, there's another lens on this, which is like our lives are creative shamanic acts that we are performing on ourselves. And the very act of us being in this quantum container of Zoom is that as you ask me this question, you're just asking a part of yourself this question. As if when you're listening to the podcast, it's just another part of you explaining things to you that you want the answer to, which is why you created the context to hear it now. And that sort of non-dualistic approach, the sort of transcension of subject-object duality, is just a practice. It's not to say that's an absolute truth either. It's to say, it's a form of, an ontological flooding, where you just allow these other ways of being, right? That's all ontology is. It's a way of being in the world. And so you just allow these other things to come in as if they're not other, and just entertain the possibility of non-otherness for a moment.
Really beautiful. Yeah, I experience your approach to be something of what I might call practical mysticism, and you may or may not like that term, but so to illuminate, our parallel paths. I was on the streets of Seattle in '99, and it was also a bit of beginning of my social awakening and starting to decode It's when I came across David Corton's work and started reading his books. And in a way, not to go into my own history, but I can understand, your counterculturalism given your background. And in a way, it's a bit more mysterious. I grew up in the very conservative South of the United States, Episcopalian, very, very enmeshed in business as usual, and with a clear program laid out for me. So it's been much more of a bloodbath of extracting myself in some ways, I project.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I think the deprogramming work and the deschooling work, it takes such different tones, right, depending on what our ancestral lines are and our relationship to that certain place. And if you believe in past lives or what have you, it's like, I also think that our belief systems themselves create the realities in which we have to account for as if they are real, right? And so our subjectivities create the nature of our metaphysical reality.
Beautiful. So can we talk about the Culture Hack Labs now? That you're part of your work now. You're a board member of something called the Culture Hack Labs. You all just kicked off a 4-part webinar series that I had the good fortune to sit in the first one yesterday, really looking at, you were laying down the theoretical framework for the role of narrative in cultural evolution. Maybe let's just start off with, what is culture hacking? What is that? What is that lens?
So part of this work came from the 8 years of the rules and the R&D and testing we were doing on how do we create new narrative environments to change the cultural context. So rather than fighting a particular policy and appealing to an all-powerful decision maker, like we need to get the UN to do X or the Trump administration to do Y, it was more like, how do we shift the discourse and the content? So, you mentioned the Overton window earlier, which is like a sociological concept of what the public deems as acceptable is the realm in which policymakers can operate. And so if you could expand that window, then you create a broader field of possibility. And so the Culture Hack Labs was in some ways a spin-off of the rules. 6 of the core team set up this cooperatively run, not-for-profit, both advisory and activist group. And I'm technically on my sabbatical year this year, so I'm not part of that team, but I sit on the board and try to support them as much as I can. So they've taken the culture hack method that was born out of the rules and really built a robust infrastructure around it. They've created a very powerful platform that allows you to pull data from multiple sources, like everything from Facebook and Twitter and the social media sphere to the LexisNexis media database to JSTOR academic database to Google Alerts, the MIT Media Cloud. And it sort of paints a picture of what the discourse is in the virtual world. And then that's mixed with other listening models, interviews with people, surveys, etc. And you get a sort of an amalgam of what is being said on a certain issue area. And then a lot of the work is also manual, right? You have to put your subjective overlay on where you want to take that narrative. And so similar to the rules, we have sociolinguist and cognitive linguist, and we bring in neuroscientists and evolutionary biologists and others with the activists to help us think through how we expand the narrative landscape. And then once that research is formed and a hypothesis is formed, we then socialize those ideas with journalists, with think tanks, with activists working in the space. And so there can be more shared narratives around what we call syntropic frames. And a syntropic frame is the opposite of an entropic frame, right? Entropy is a cycle of degradation and a breakdown, essentially, of cohesion and discourse. And syntropic frames create more cohesion, more unity, more of a sense of interdependence and an ethic of interbeing. And that's part of the contribution that Culture Act Labs is making.
And yeah, so what is the role of narrative in our post-truth world, where it's so obvious to most people now? It just, the information sphere is so confusing. It's hard to know what is true. Our ideologies have become radicalized. We can go anywhere online to confirm our bias. So I'm curious, both at a personal level, how do you go about your own sense making? And maybe the question around narrative is a distinct question.
Yeah, I think, there's this old political adage that is sometimes attributed to Gramsci, but the line is, we are prisoners of context in the absence of meaning. We're prisoners of context in the absence of meaning. And that is a direct result of late stage capitalism. That's part of the logic of entropy that is rooted at the heart of the capitalist system. And this sort of this ennui, this anxiety, this sense of depression, this sense of being unanchored in the world is in some ways not only the logical outcome, but it's necessitated by the system. And so we sort of wonder, like, why are we in this place of sort of post-truth confusion? But to go back to really understanding the system, if we look at how the system is operating, about 93 cents or so of every dollar of wealth created ends up in the hands of the top 1%, right? So by definition, wealth creation, even if it's in the social capitalist world, as if such a thing exists, ends up serving the rich, creating more impoverishment, concentrating power, right? Every dollar of wealth created is heating up the planet because we have a fossil fuel extractive based system. There's nothing that doesn't have fossil fuels in it. There's almost, right? There's very few things that we can do that are not harmful to the environment. And we're all enmeshed in that contradiction, and we all know it on some level. And so you have this kind of totalitarian operating system, right? It's the oxygen by which we breathe. Debt-based capital, money, is mediating every aspect of our lives: where we live, what we're eating, what we're doing for work, who we get to spend time with, all of it. There's nothing that's not mediated by capital. And so in order for a system like that to preserve itself, it has to it has to prevent you from looking in the places that would unhinge its existence, right? And so that system from its very beginning has separated us from the natural world, right? The natural world has to be other in order for us to not feel guilty about the consumption and destruction of the living planet. So that's enmeshed in it, right? In order for the Ponzi scheme of capitalism to work, we have to other people in the global south: Black people, Asians, Latin Americans, Mexican migrants, whatever because somebody has to do that work, and those resources have to be extracted from somewhere to prop up the Western way of living. And so when that is your root culture, when that is your operating system, that othering of everything, the logical outcome is we are going to feel lost, we are going to feel atomized, we are going to feel disconnected, because we are. And so in a situation like that, truth doesn't matter. The only thing that matters in the theology of neoliberalism is more growth, right? That's basically the solution and the answer to all political discourse. Doesn't matter, Biden, Trump, whatever, you break it down, it'll be couched in other things. It'll be couched in jobs, security, growth. But it's not, it's never discussed in terms of life. And in some ways, life and growth are in dire contradiction. They're oppositional to each other, because growth requires the destruction of life. And so, part of the role of the new, when you say new, maybe new and ancient narratives that are emerging that need to disrupt both the broader cultural story and our individual stories of how are we showing up on a day-to-day basis, right? What's our relationship with food? What's our relationship with the land around us? What's our relationship with our partners, each other, our community, ourselves? Is to create these sort of pro-life narratives, right? To put the primacy of the living planet at its center. And I see that as the role of narrative. But I don't see narrative intervention work or social change work as some kind of panacea. Like all we need to do is change the story. I've heard many people, especially in the New Age, say that. And it's like, yeah, that's one component of it for sure. And what's the deeper purpose of that? Well, the deeper purpose of that is to recast our relationship with the world in which we are enmeshed. And it's to make us question our practices and behaviors and modes of being in order to be in a more animistic, entangled quantum relationship with the living world. And then if we do that, then narrative is serving the deepening of the inquiry that we need to go into to decide how do we want to live when all of this collapses, and which it will, which is inevitable. And how do we want to be in relationship to the consequences of the things we set into motion and our ancestors set into motion. And that's the moment we're in. And so what a strong narrative environment does is it gives us permission to have those discussions and to go into that inquiry. But it also requires community. It also requires sovereignty, especially like food sovereignty and material security. And part of the reason I'm interested in political economy is to think about how do you create a world where 7 billion or 8 billion human beings, or however many are left after the process of industrial capitalism has its way with us. How do we create a world where we are not keeping body and soul together, that the basics of life are met, so that we could create an environment where we're having a spiritual creative renaissance on this planet, where all human beings can contribute to this bigger project. And that's also then related to the idea of mythology, right? And what is the shared mythology? What is the spirit project of our generation, or the generations that are now working together to create the post-anthropocentric world, which is also related to ritual and ceremony and creating intact cultures that know, at least that are embedded with the knowledge that can hold all of us in our diversity. And so all of these things have to come together. And narrative is just one piece of that emerging puzzle.
That was so rich. There's so many different little portals I could jump through in all that you just spoke. I feel like with COVID and the Black Lives Matter movement, all that's happened in 2020, there's been sort of this rush to, in the disruption, which has been real, there's been this rush to, it's time for the new story, as though we know what that new story is without, yesterday in the webinar you said, and what I appreciate about your work, you're often prefacing with like, I'm not speaking an absolute truth. This is just something to put on the table. The gesture we're gesturing towards versus providing an answer. And I feel like there's been this almost this rush to throw a new story over the old machinery, as though that would do the work, the hard work that you're speaking to, which is, maybe the truth doesn't matter, but just to sit down and feel, to feel where we are, to feel the grief. I have a question. What I notice that often happens with people when this conversation comes up, and it does start to peel back something that they've intuitively known, there's the tendency to to feel paralyzed by the hugeness of it, or to go into guilt. Those privileged just to go into sort of a frozen guilt. And I'm wondering, I mean, is there a healthy role that guilt plays? Is there a way, do we need to titrate these feelings? I'm curious what you have to say about that reaction.
Yeah. Maybe we start with the subjective part of like, all I'm really doing is wondering aloud, right? I don't believe in the idea of expertise. I may have spent more time than the average person, perhaps, thinking about political economy and social justice and things like this. But there are people who are way more advanced in these issues than I am. And I'm more sort of trying to bring these discussions and these inquiries into a public sphere where really the invitation is to take these inquiries into your own life, right? And the sort of role of grief in that is critical, at least to me, right? What I sense is there's this line by Martin Prechtel, who I'm sure you know, who wrote some beautiful books, and he says, all war is unmetabolized grief. All war is unmetabolized grief. And so on one level, our inability to sit with ourselves and really feel into the destruction that our way of living has created on the planet is part of the problem, right? We're so distracted that we don't create the space to do that. And so I think there's a critical role for grief. Guilt is a more tricky thought form, and maybe a less constructive thought form in some ways. And I wouldn't say let's not feel it, no, because that may be part of the trajectory of emotions that we need to go through. Right. We don't want to amputate any emotion in this process. But grief does feel like a requirement, let's say, to actually create space, to allow our cups to be filled by something else. But if we don't empty the cup, which requires communal context, and it requires ritual, and it requires ceremony, and it requires space. And in some ways, this liminal space of COVID has done that for many people. It's created more space, but we also will, our egos will just find new ways to distract ourselves. We'll sign up to 12 online Zoom courses and, try to learn new languages we'll never speak. And, there's many ways the ego will trick ourselves to channel our guilt into some seemingly productive way of being. And so I do think it's important to create silence individually and also to create group ritual in community around here's what I'm feeling, here's what I'm grappling with in being a human alive that has benefited from 1,000 generations that came before me, that lived and died largely miserable lives in a lot of pain, and also acknowledging that we are healing those lines through the work we're doing now, right? Our ancestors are literally living through us and through the experiences we're having. And they all dealt with the same thought forms of grief, of guilt, of shame, of responsibility. And so how do we metabolize those in new ways and really take responsibility? And at the same time, I think there's also the work of changing the superstructure itself, right? How am I going to contribute to changing the broader culture? And then there's also the work of individual embodiment, of how do I deepen my practice in order to be a worthy citizen of the Anthropocene. And that, there's an old Vedic line that says, our work should never exceed our practice. Our work should never exceed our practice. And I think this is the moment for the sadhana, for the ritual, for that individual practice, but it's also the moment for Sangha, for the community. And as we cultivate both of these things, we're going to realize that this is much less difficult than we think it is, right? That we fear the process, but there is no process. There's only resistance. And so the less we're in resistance of what is becoming and what we're moving towards, the easier that process is. Like in many ways, the most difficult thing we could do is to try to keep this existing system propped up, even if we're so-called the privileged in this, right? Because the one percenters and those who are benefiting from this existing system are actually not happy themselves, right? On another spiritual, metaphysical level, they know that they are the recipients of the blood, tears, labor, commodification of black and brown bodies around the world. On another level, they also know that the only reason we as privileged people have what we have is because others don't have what they have. This is not the expanding pie metaphor. There is a limit to the material realm. And especially in a debt-based system, a growth-based capitalist system, there is a zero-sum game playing out. And now to get to a non-zero-sum game requires us walking away from the idea of debt-based capital. And so that may feel outside of us, right? That may feel bigger than us. But if we don't address it, nothing else will be addressed. And by trying to prop up this existing system, just think about like how difficult it is to keep late stage capitalism in place, right? Oil reserves are running out, so we start fracking. Population's dwindling, so we start importing labor from other places, displacing other human beings. The role of the IMF and the World Bank, for example, in some respects, is to clear massive tracts of land, largely of indigenous people in places like Africa and Asia and Latin America, to grow monoculture, to feed the West. The sheer amount of effort and
well, to say nothing of the mental health is dismal in the first world, and so we just keep pushing pills down our throats.
The karmic implications of it that then take its toll in all sorts of mental disease, like it's unfathomable, right? And we may say that it's utopian to create a new system, but I think the only utopian belief, the only utopian in the negative sense, because I think there's a very important aspect of utopian thinking that we actually need to recalibrate. But when it's used as a sort of critique of dreaming, I think in that sense the only utopian belief is that we can keep on going as we are. That's an insane belief, right? That everything defies that logic, right? And then it's important to just, let's talk for a second about how this debt-based system works, right? The World Bank and others, economists, world governments will say we need to grow the global economy at 3% a year, right? That's the minimum in order to not have deflation, stagflation, etc. Well, 3% doesn't sound like a lot, but it's the doubling of the global economy every 20 years. That's what 3% annual growth does. It doubles the global economy every 20 years. Can you imagine the doubling of our current global economy of $80+ trillion, right? Double the amount of iPhones, Big Macs, Toyota Priuses, Nike shoes. Like, it's physically impossible. We've already crossed 4 or 5 of the 9 planetary bounds. There's no way that can happen. So within the next 20 years, we're going to see the collapse of that system. And as that system collapses, it's going to become more extreme in its reaction and in its ability to take more. And you're going to see the rise of authoritarian states and, corporate fascism and, gilded gates and closed communities and private submarine sales and private helicopter sales and private island sales, because they know what's coming. And yet they would rather be, on top of a sinking ship rather than to reconstruct a ship that will benefit everyone. So if all of us say, we're going to be good students of our culture, we're going to understand what's happening now in this global system, and we are not only going to create the community context at a local level for what that post-capitalist reality is, but we are going to be in the practice of trying to embody those values. Well, you could see that as affliction, or you could see that as assignment, right? What better dharma to play out than to have incarnated in a time where an old system that has not served us or our ancestors or the more than human world is dying. So to be able to be witness to that and to claim a new seat in that and to reconfigure our role in the world, well, that's a high honor. Like we could see that as something that is deeply distressing and depressing, or we can see that as, oh, like I'm going to all these new age workshops about purpose, and my purpose has been defined for me by the context and the moment in which I'm in.
Beautiful. It reminds me of the elder Joanna Macy in her. I've heard her proclamation many times. Just the thrill of being here in this time, as you're saying, and I appreciate the caution, if you will, or the flip that maybe the process isn't going to be as it's what we tell ourselves, the story we tell ourselves about the process that is often so paralyzing. There's so much doom and apocalypse being peddled. And so maybe to a couple questions bringing us towards a close, to focus on, you've already brought in the cultural evolution work with this sort of vectoring towards this new emerging narrative, the syntropic space of entanglement. So, and I think this is probably dovetailed with your background as what you called a mystical anarchist. I'd like to unpack that a little bit, only because I think it's not to reify that, but I do think it dovetails with this rising interest in indigenous wisdom and methodologies, and not as a way of cultural appropriation, but as like a sincere, like earnest longing to remember. Mm-hmm. And I know from my own experience, like time spent in the Dene reservation in the Hogan, I had the good fortune of having a very close friend who was a Navajo medicine man who died a few years ago. And right in the Hogan, we sit on a circle on the earth floor, and often the methodology is one of storytelling, and we go around, and every voice is important, and we stay and we listen to every word everyone has to say. It doesn't matter how long it takes, that the sense that and I'm hearing that in your vision you just shared a little while ago around as we create systems that engender this sovereignty, this explosion of creativity that is encoded in us, right? As beings of the earth. We are of creation. We are creation. We are creators.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I where to start on that? There's a lot there, and maybe the place to start is to say, well, what is mysticism, right? Because it's a word that often triggers many people the way spirituality does. But mysticism just means, at its simplest level, a direct relationship with the divine, with something greater than the individual unit of I. And within it is also an approach, and that approach is one of awe and wonder and mystery, which is where the word comes from. And that is a practice, right? To the Western mind, to the Occidental mind, we have been socialized in this scientific rationalist enlightenment belief that we will know everything eventually, right? And we're searching for the theory of everything. The whole world can be reduced to the atom to the proton and the neutron and the electron, that to a quark. And as we go smaller and smaller into the fractals of reality, what we're realizing is that at the quanta level, we actually do not understand what is happening. And that humility that is required, that epistemic humility that is the sort of root of mysticism, is where science is finally getting to now. Although, the high priests of science will never admit that. And so it's a disposition towards humility and towards direct relationship. And so the anathema to mysticism is institutional religion, right? And any structure that has made the decisions on the big questions, on the first principles questions of where are we going, why are we here, what is my purpose, when we attach ourselves to those vehicles, it's an abdication of our responsibility as living beings who have chosen to incarnate on this planet now. And so I think the resurgence of mystical impulse is critical. And it doesn't matter what path you enter that from. It could be the religion you were born into, right? In many ways, I was born into Islam. I rejected Islam to understand that the heretical, mystical path that I was born into of Sufism within Islam is just one lens to get me out of the dogma of what happened to that religion, right? And in some ways, that is the redemption work of my ancestry, is to get outside of the structure that was built by people who didn't know what they were doing for many thousands of years and who were a product of very difficult circumstance and context and needed to believe in certain things in order to rationalize, justify, survive. So we park that for a second and we go to anarchism. And anarchism is also often seen as a sort of negative notion, right? Anarchism is conflated with anarchy. And
which is conflated with rioting these days.
Exactly, right. And the complex of things you could, Antifa. And it's like anarchy and chaos may be synonymous in illiterate culture, but anarchism is a sophisticated political philosophy that is about self-governance and self-rule and direct relationship with the set of laws that regulate our lives. So in that sense, it's very parallel and commensurate with the mystical impulse. And the old anarchist tagline in some ways was "No gods, no masters." And the mystical approach is no imams, no popes, no Qurans, no Bibles. It's not that we deny them, it's like you accept them all. And similar to the anarchist belief is like the role of government is to localize power. We're not saying there should be no government. It's just the role of government should be to localize power to the unit that matters, to human scale, to the community scale, because that's where lived experiences happen. And so to abstract our political system into Washington, D.C. or Beijing or Ottawa or wherever is the equivalent of dysfunctional institutional religion. They're the same impulse of control, domination, hierarchy, monopoly over knowledge or resources or what have you. And so I think people who believe in sovereignty and who believe in a sort of deeper purpose in their lives and than being told what reality is, are essentially mystical anarchists, in that sense. And look, the title is just the title. Who cares what it means? Whatever way you pursue your freedom is relevant to you, use that language.
Beautiful. I remember as maybe a 15-year-old, right around the time actually I was being confirmed into the church. This is pre-internet days, so it was a booklet, right, that I had been given on anarchism and this principle of subsidiarity and mutual aid. I don't remember what the words were back then, but I do remember I remember reading this, and at a deeply intuitive level, this makes sense to me. And at the same time, here I was being confirmed into the church and asked to take on this intermediary, with my experience with the divine, which I found quite difficult. I went through the motions, but kicking inside.
Mm-hmm.
And as you're speaking, right, it's clear to see the dysfunction of the bottleneck of trying to centralize what it makes so much sense at a local level. Who's going to know better, how the water is, how the air is, how our relations are.
And another sort of lens on distinguishing mysticism and religion is that mysticism worships creation and religion worships a creator. And the reason anarchism makes sense to me as a political philosophy, that it's about worshiping creation. That's what mutual aid is, right? Subsidiarity is just the idea that people at the base level of that decision, the people who are affected, get to make that decision. And that is a form of reverence towards creation. Mm-hmm. And I think what's happening now as well is we have to start bringing in a sort of post-anthropocentric logic into our decision making, right? How do we acknowledge the agency of trees, of animals, of other living beings, and not in a just like let's check boxes or speak for them, but to really be in that reverence. And I would say that in that sense, animism is the antidote to rationalism and to materialism. And the switch between seeing the world as sort of mechanistic parts that only have a material reality, and the value of that materiality is judged by what we as subjective humans believe is important and not, to a more animistic field where we are in direct communion with the more than human living world, is it's not a switch to be flipped. It is a practice, right? Just like direct democracy is a practice, right? For us to start being in the relational field where we're making decisions as citizens about what affects us requires practice, right? We've had 500 years of a very different type of practice in how political economy works. And we've had no sort of training, right? And no practice as people who are governing together. Like, what does that even mean? And so this is the task of our time now, to create these new contexts so we can start practicing what it is to be in relationship with each other, with the natural world, with ourselves, and then bequeath that to the next generation who can actually start creating something with that.
I think it's important, to highlight, right, that it isn't the flipping of the switch. And there was that sense of with COVID, a switch was flipped, and no, as maybe a veil was pulled down. And I spoke with Tyson Yokaporta actually just yesterday, and from his lineage perspective, this is a 1,000-year process, of unwinding. And in a way, the most important thing we can be doing is passing down the good stories, both cautionary tales and tales of potentiality, of self as creation, as you're saying, bringing in this reverence for creation, which is all of us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And there's a great line from the anarchist tradition, which is behave as if you're already free. That's part of the practice of this moment, is to live and embody those ideals. And that makes the transition so much easier. And it requires work, right? It requires asking ourselves the question of what are we willing to sacrifice to create that more beautiful world? And sacrifice doesn't have to be, the kind of Judeo-Christian guilt-laden version of sacrifice. It's a willingness to give from the motivation of love and generosity and magnanimity rather than scarcity.
And maybe we'll be surprised to discover deep joy in that sacrifice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it won't even be called sacrifice, right? It will be called something else.
The way of life.
Yeah, a romantic gesture towards the universe.
Mm-hmm. Alnoor, maybe one last question. What have you been doing on your sabbatical? What's your edge? What's your edge space?
Mm-hmm. I think really deepening my practice. The more chaotic the external world gets, is to deepen my spiritual practice, to be in prayer more often. And again, not prayer in a Judeo-Christian sense of praying to something outside of me, but being deeply present with the context that I find myself in, and trying to enter rooms and praying for all the souls in that room and their ancestors and the trees and the wind and the elements and whatever I come into contact with. And yeah, trying not to be distracted by all the distractions that exist, and just focusing on that for a period of time, so I can come back into the political work more available and more ready, and more deconditioned. And in many ways, I feel like that will be more service to the movement than, bringing my fatigue from 8 years of the rules, or my baggage, or my unexamined biases and traumas. And I also live in community, which part of the practice is it requires a lot more than paying a mortgage and living in a isolated individual unit, right? It's kind of demands of you. What isolation never will in some ways. And that has its benefits for sure. That's why I do it. And it has its challenges. And so, I've been just relearning the basics, relearning farming and gardening, and being in right relationship with my food, and right relationship with my ancestors and the land around me, and being in that sense of offering, and it's a process for sure, and there's moments where I see something happening in the world and I just want to jump back into it, but really taking that time to just be okay, for at least this year, I'm just going to be in reflection. And so, I created an altar to the mother at the beginning of the year, and I just said, I'm not going to make any career decisions or work decisions or what have you. Even the idea of career is so ridiculous right now, but just to be in prayer and to ask how I can be in service, and then also just to be in gift, to not be in relationship with money for a year. And that's also the beauty of living in community, is that I can do that. And so those are kind of the two practices I'm in right now.
I appreciate you modeling that for us, and that you were able to create the conditions to do so. And I know you often tear at this sort of false binary between outer work and inner work, and should I focus on the superstructure or what's just right in front of me? And I know you pull on the work of Sri Aurobindo and integral yoga, which also I have deep regard. I call it the full court press, because of course it's all of it. It's all of it that we need to be tending to, and in different moments we're called to different stages. And so I bow to this time that you're doing the inner work, knowing that you do it for all of us.
Thank you. Yeah, likewise. Thank you for the time and the conversation and the beautiful questions, and holding this space and bringing important information and knowledge and conversations out to the broader sphere.
Okay. And that, my friends, concludes the action-packed episode with Alnoor Ladha. Thanks so much for listening, and as a friendly reminder to please give the podcast a review on iTunes, share the podcast with friends and family just to spread the good word, and if you have the capacity and are inspired even for a period of time, if you can help financially support the podcast at www.astemperaturesrise.com to ensure more great content to come. And until next time, my friends, behave as if you're already free.